The city of New York buzzed with its usual chaos, horns blaring as raindrops cascaded from the gray skies. Reflections of the city lights shimmered on the rain-soaked streets, creating a kaleidoscope of color beneath the sea of umbrellas. Inside his sleek black car, Alexander Grayson, CEO of one of the largest financial corporations in the city, was lost in thought. His eyes remained fixed on the road, but his mind raced through the details of an important business presentation awaiting him in London. For Alexander, everything in life had a plan. Success wasn't a matter of chance. It was meticulously calculated, step by step. He had come a long way from the boy who had once shivered on the streets, scrounging for spare coins and shelter. Those memories, though distant, had shaped him. They had taught him to build walls that no one could easily penetrate. His luxurious lifestyle, sprawling mansion, and pristine reputation were proof of his triumph over hardship. Emotions, he believed, were a distraction, and for years he had locked them away. But today, something unexpected was about to disrupt his carefully managed life. As Alexander's car slowed at a red light, he saw her, a young woman holding a baby, huddled on the sidewalk in the pouring rain. Her tattered coat clung to her thin frame as she tried to shield her child from the elements. The cardboard sign in her trembling hands read, "Please help. We need food and shelter." Despite the downpour, the woman's eyes were fierce, filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. Alexander's gaze lingered on her longer than it should have, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He told himself to look away, but the memory of his own struggles clawed at him. He had been that child once, clutching his mother's hand as they begged for warmth and safety. The light turned green, but Alexander remained frozen in place. Something deep within him, something he thought had been buried, stirred to life. Before he could second-guess himself, he lowered the car window and gestured for the woman to come closer. Rain splashed against the car door as she hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. With the baby pressed tightly to her chest, she cautiously approached. "Get in," Alexander said, his voice surprisingly soft, almost unrecognizable to himself. The woman hesitated, her wide eyes scanning him for any hint of ill intent. But with the rain drenching her and her child shivering, she nodded and slid into the car's back seat, cradling her daughter protectively. Alexander turned up the heater, the warmth quickly filling the car as they pulled away from the curb. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler this time. "Grace," she replied, barely above a whisper. Her arms tightened around her baby. "And this is Lucy." Alexander glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Grace's face, though pale and weary, held an undeniable resilience. For reasons he didn't yet understand, he felt drawn to her, this stranger who had stepped out of the rain and into his life. Alexander drove through the wet streets in silence, the soft hum of the car engine the only sound between them. His mind should have been focused on the flight he needed to catch, on the multi-million-dollar business deal that awaited him overseas. But instead, his thoughts circled back to the woman sitting behind him, her arms wrapped protectively around her sleeping daughter. Her clothes were soaked, and her hair clung to her face in damp strands, but what struck Alexander most was her eyes. They were tired, yes, but behind that exhaustion was a fire, a stubborn will to survive. He recognized it because once upon a time, it had burned in him too. He couldn't ignore the conflict brewing inside him. This wasn't something he normally did. Alexander Grayson wasn't the type to take strangers into his home. His life was built on calculated decisions, not impulse-driven acts of compassion. But something about Grace, her vulnerability mixed with fierce determination, shattered the logic that usually governed him. His fingers tapped the steering wheel as he made a split-second decision. The airport was in the opposite direction, but without a second thought, he turned the car toward his mansion in the Upper East Side. The sprawling property rarely felt like a home to him, but tonight it would be a refuge for someone who desperately needed it. When they arrived, Grace stared wide-eyed at the mansion, its tall glass windows glowing warmly against the backdrop of the storm. She didn't say a word, but her expression was enough to show her disbelief. Alexander stepped out of the car, opened the back door, and helped her out. Rain poured down, soaking his expensive suit, but he didn't care. As Grace stood, cradling Lucy close, Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver key. "You can stay here until I get back," he said, pressing the key into her trembling hand. "There's food, warm clothes, everything you might need." Grace's breath hitched, her fingers closing tightly around the key as if she feared it might vanish. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "There's no need," Alexander replied, avoiding her gaze. Vulnerability wasn't something he handled well. "Just take care of yourself and the baby. That's all I ask." Without waiting for her to respond, he turned and walked back to his car, his shoes splashing in the puddles. The moment he got behind the wheel, he felt the weight of what he'd just done settle on his chest. What was he thinking, leaving a stranger in his house? But as he drove toward the airport, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the right choice. Grace, meanwhile, stood frozen at the mansion's entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so many nights on the streets, bracing herself against the cold and shielding Lucy from danger. This was different. It felt like a lifeline. Clutching the baby close, she whispered, "We're safe, Lucy. At least for tonight." With a deep breath, she stepped inside, not knowing that this act of kindness would change both of their lives forever. Grace's footsteps echoed softly as she entered the mansion, her shoes leaving wet prints on the polished marble floor. The warmth inside immediately enveloped her, a stark contrast to the icy rain outside. She paused in the grand foyer, taking in her surroundings, a sweeping staircase, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an enormous crystal chandelier casting a soft golden glow. Everything about the place seemed surreal, as if she had stepped into a dream. Lucy stirred in her arms, letting out a tiny whimper. Grace instinctively kissed the top of her daughter's head and rocked her gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're safe now." Exploring cautiously, Grace passed through the open-concept living room, where sleek modern furniture sat in perfect arrangement, and abstract art adorned the walls. She found herself both in awe and overwhelmed. What was she doing in a place like this? What if she accidentally broke something or overstepped her welcome? Doubt crept into her mind, but she pushed it aside. For now, this wasn't about her pride. It was about giving Lucy a warm bed and a full belly, even if only for one night. In the kitchen, she found cabinets stocked with fresh food, breads, fruits, and ingredients she hadn't seen in months. Her stomach growled, reminding her of how long it had been since her last proper meal. But Grace hesitated. Was it really okay to help herself? Alexander had said everything she needed was here, but a part of her still felt like an intruder. As hunger gnawed at her, she finally convinced herself to take what she needed. She found a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, and some butter, and began cooking a simple meal. The sound of eggs sizzling in the pan was oddly comforting, and as the aroma filled the kitchen, she felt a flicker of peace she hadn't known in years. She imagined Lucy waking up to a warm breakfast, a luxury she hadn't been able to provide in so long. After eating, she carried Lucy upstairs, her tired legs barely able to climb the elegant staircase. At the top, she opened a door and discovered a guest bedroom, its king-sized bed covered in crisp white sheets. Gently, she laid Lucy down and tucked her in, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. The sight of her child sleeping peacefully brought tears to Grace's eyes. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting herself feel the relief of knowing they were safe for the night. But as comforting as the warmth of the house was, her mind was still restless. Memories of the past, of everything she had lost, clawed their way back. She had once dreamed of becoming a doctor, of building a future where she could make her parents proud. But life had thrown her one cruel twist after another, stripping her of those dreams and leaving her to fight for survival on the streets. She gently rubbed her fingers over the silver key Alexander had given her, wondering why a man like him would help someone like her. Was it just an impulsive act of pity? Or did he see something in her worth saving? Grace didn't know, but she was determined to show him she wasn't just another beggar. No matter how long this kindness lasted, she would use it to regain her footing. As she slipped under the warm covers beside her daughter, she silently made a vow. "I'll find a way to rebuild our lives," she whispered to the sleeping Lucy. "This is only the beginning." That night, for the first time in months, Grace fell asleep without fear of the cold or the dangers of the streets. The soft sheets and the warmth of the room cradled her like a protective cocoon. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, it was calm, a stillness she hadn't experienced in a long time. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Grace stirred awake, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her and the peaceful quiet surrounding her. For a brief second, she feared she was dreaming, but as she looked around and saw Lucy curled up beside her, her heart swelled with gratitude. This was real. Lucy yawned, rubbing her sleepy eyes before spotting her mother watching her. With a giggle, the toddler reached out, her tiny fingers grazing Grace's cheek. "Mama," she mumbled, her voice soft and sweet. Grace pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, kissing her on the forehead. "Good morning, my little star," she whispered, her voice cracking from emotion. After a quick breakfast made from the leftovers in the kitchen, Grace decided to explore the mansion further. Lucy toddled along beside her, clutching her stuffed toy bear, her laughter echoing in the large, empty hallways. Grace marveled at the luxurious surroundings, the marble floors, the ornate furniture, and the walls adorned with paintings that seemed worth more than anything she had ever owned. Despite the grandeur, the mansion felt strangely empty. There were no family photos on the walls, no signs of a life lived beyond the perfection of its decor. It was as if the house itself reflected its owner, immaculate on the surface, but missing something deeper. She wondered about Alexander. Who was he really? Later that morning, Lucy found a plush area rug in the living room and sat down to play, giggling as she made her stuffed bear dance across the floor. Grace watched from the couch, her heart lightening at the sight of her daughter's pure joy. It had been so long since she had seen Lucy this happy, and the moment filled her with an overwhelming sense of hope. But that hope was fragile. What if this safety didn't last? What if Alexander returned and asked them to leave? Just as the thought began to weigh on her, a familiar voice interrupted her. "You both seem comfortable." Grace's head snapped up, and there he was, Alexander, standing in the doorway. He was dressed casually, in a fitted sweater and dark jeans, a departure from the polished businessman she had seen the night before. His presence filled the room effortlessly, and yet there was a softness to him now, a quiet curiosity in his gaze as he watched Lucy play. Grace stood quickly, smoothing the wrinkles in her borrowed clothes. I didn't expect you back so soon," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and anxiety. "If you need us to leave, we can—" Alexander raised a hand, silencing her with a gentle shake of his head. "No, that's not why I'm here." He stepped farther into the room, his gaze shifting briefly to Lucy, who smiled and waved her stuffed bear at him. His lips curved into a faint smile. "I just wanted to check in," he continued, his voice calm. "Make sure you and Lucy are okay." "We are," Grace replied softly. "More than okay. Thank you again for letting us stay here. It means more than I can say." For a moment, Alexander hesitated, as if something deeper weighed on his mind. He looked down at his hands, then back at Grace. "I don't do this often," he admitted. "Helping strangers. But there's something about you. I don't know why, but it feels right." Grace's breath caught in her throat. His words weren't just about charity, they were personal. She saw it in the way he looked at her, as if he was trying to understand the connection that had already begun forming between them. I'm not used to people helping me, Grace said quietly, lowering her gaze. Most just walk past without even looking. I've been one of those people, Alexander confessed, stepping closer. For years I told myself I didn't have time to care. But seeing you on that street, it reminded me of a part of my life I thought I had buried. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of their shared pasts hung between them, both of them shaped by struggle, both of them silently carrying burdens they hadn't shared with anyone else. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. I'll never forget this, Alexander. What you've done for me and Lucy. And I don't think I'll forget you either, he replied, his voice low and sincere. You've already made more of an impact than you know. The tension between them shifted, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something new, an understanding, perhaps, that this encounter had already changed both of their lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. As Alexander crouched to play with Lucy, who offered him the stuffed bear, Grace watched him with a mix of wonder and warmth. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Hope. Later that day, as sunlight poured through the mansion's massive windows, Grace helped Lucy settle down for an afternoon nap. She hummed softly while stroking her daughter's hair, grateful for the peaceful moment. But as soon as Lucy's breathing became steady, a knock on the front door shattered the calm. Grace's heart raced. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she cautiously made her way downstairs, each step amplifying her anxiety. When she opened the door, a woman stood there, tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating an air of authority. Victoria Sinclair. Victoria's gaze swept over Grace, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her red lips curved into a cold, polite smile, but her eyes betrayed her disdain. Well, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I assume you're the one Alexander has been playing savior to. Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall. I'm Grace, she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Victoria stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her high heels clicking against the marble floor. I'm sure Alexander didn't tell you much about me, but let me fill in the blanks. I've known him for years. We have a history. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A deep one. Grace could feel her walls going up, protecting her from the venom hidden in Victoria's words. I'm not sure what you're implying, she replied carefully. Oh, don't play naive, Victoria said, circling the living room like she owned the place. You may have fooled him for now, but I know your type. Vulnerable woman, sob story, desperate for help, until you sink your claws into a man like Alexander. Anger flared in Grace's chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm not after his money, if that's what you're suggesting. He offered to help me and my daughter, and I'm grateful. That's all. Victoria laughed a sharp, cutting sound. Grateful? That's how it starts. But people like you always want more. She leaned in closer, her gaze icy. Let me give you some advice. Take what you've been given and leave before he realizes what a mistake this is. People like us don't mix with people like you. The words hit harder than Grace expected, not because she believed them, but because they echoed the doubts she had tried to bury. Was she a burden? Would Alexander eventually regret helping her? Before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the tension. Victoria, what are you doing here? Both women turned to see him standing at the entrance to the living room, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation. I was just visiting, Victoria said smoothly, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Checking in to make sure you haven't made a mistake. Alexander's gaze shifted to Grace, and something inside her cracked. He had a right to doubt her, didn't he? Maybe Victoria was just saying what Alexander had already thought deep down. I don't want to cause any trouble, Grace said quietly, lowering her eyes. Maybe Victoria's right. We should leave. Alexander frowned, stepping forward. What are you talking about? Grace, I don't want you to go. But Victoria wasn't done. Alexander, think about it. You barely know her. She could be taking advantage of you. Alexander hesitated, and in that moment, Grace felt the walls she had built around her heart tremble. The weight of the humiliation and distrust was too much. Fighting back tears, she scooped Lucy into her arms and turned toward the door. "I appreciate what you did for us," she said, her voice shaking. "But I won't stay where I'm not wanted." "Grace, wait." Alexander called after her, but she was already out the door. The cold afternoon air hit her face, mixing with the warmth of her tears as she hurried down the driveway. She didn't know where she would go next. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in a place where doubt hung over her like a storm cloud. Back inside, Alexander stood frozen, watching the door slowly swing shut. His chest tightened as he replayed the scene over and over. He had hesitated just for a second, but that second had cost him something important. Victoria's smug expression only made it worse. "I think you've done enough," Alexander said coldly, turning toward her. "You need to leave, Alexander. Now." His tone left no room for argument. As Victoria left, Alexander sank into the couch, running a hand through his hair. Guilt gnawed at him. Why did I let her leave? His instincts had told him to protect Grace, to believe her. But for a moment, his fear of making a mistake had silenced that instinct. Now, he was left with regret. He had seen the pain in Grace's eyes, the weight of betrayal, and it crushed him. But he wasn't ready to give up on her. Not yet. The following morning, Alexander sat in his study, surrounded by papers and reports that demanded his attention. But his mind wasn't on business. His thoughts were consumed by Grace, how her voice had trembled when she said goodbye, how she had carried Lucy with quiet dignity despite the pain she must have felt. The regret was unbearable. He had let her leave when he should have fought for her, should have protected her. For years, Alexander had built his life on control, but in the span of a day, he realized how powerless he felt without her and Lucy in his home. Determined to make things right, Alexander picked up his phone and called a private investigator. "I need you to find someone for me, Grace and her daughter, Lucy," he said firmly. "I don't care how long it takes. I need to know they're okay." The next few days were agonizing. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of them. The echoes of Lucy's laughter seemed to haunt the empty halls, and the living room felt cold without Grace's warmth. Alexander hadn't realized just how much they had changed his home until they were gone. The once pristine space now felt sterile, lifeless. On the third day, the investigator called. "We've located her, sir. She's staying at a small shelter on the outskirts of the city." Alexander's heart clenched. A shelter. He couldn't bear the thought of them back on the streets, especially after knowing how much they had endured. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and car keys, ignoring his packed schedule. When he arrived at the shelter, the modest building looked far removed from the luxury he was used to. But none of that mattered. His gaze searched the small crowd of people coming and going until he saw her. Grace. She was sitting on a bench outside, Lucy curled up asleep in her lap. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But she still radiated the quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, watching her. He realized that the mansion had been more than just a place of shelter for her. It had been a chance to breathe, to rest, to dream of something better. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward her. Grace looked up, startled, and when she saw him, her expression shifted from shock to guarded caution. She gently adjusted Lucy in her arms and stood, her shoulders stiff. "Alexander," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I made a mistake, Grace. I let someone plant doubts in my head, and I didn't listen to my heart when it told me to trust you." Grace looked away, blinking rapidly. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "You've already done more for me than anyone else ever has. But I can't stay where people see me as a burden." "You were never a burden," Alexander said, stepping closer. "I let fear get in the way, and it cost me something I didn't realize I needed until you left." His voice cracked slightly as he added, You and Lucy brought life into that house, Grace. You made me feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Hope, warmth, family. Grace's breath hitched. For so long, she had built walls around her heart to protect herself from disappointment, but Alexander's words were chipping away at them. I know I hurt you, he continued, his eyes filled with remorse. But I'm here because I don't want to lose you. Please come back. Not as a guest, but as part of my life. We'll build something real together. No doubts, no fears. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she looked down at Lucy, still peacefully asleep in her arms. Her daughter deserved a stable home, and for the first time, Grace realized that maybe Alexander wasn't offering charity. He was offering something genuine. A second chance. Her gaze met his, and she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the sincerity of his regret. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. But only if we build this on trust. I won't let Lucy or myself go through more uncertainty. I promise, Alexander said, his voice firm. No more uncertainty. No more doubts. Relief flooded both of them as they stood there, the weight of their burdens finally beginning to lift. Alexander gently reached out, brushing a tear from Grace's cheek. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She felt seen. Let's go home, she said softly. And this time, she believed it. The drive back to the mansion was quiet but filled with meaning. Lucy slept peacefully in her car seat, her tiny fingers clutching the stuffed bear Grace had packed in a hurry when they left the shelter. Beside her, Grace gazed out the window, watching the city blur past. But this time, her thoughts weren't clouded by fear or uncertainty. They were focused on the future. When the mansion finally came into view, Grace's breath caught in her throat. The sprawling glass windows shimmered under the evening light, and the sight felt different now. It wasn't just a luxurious building. It was a place where she could begin again. Alexander parked the car and quickly stepped out to help Grace and Lucy inside. As they entered, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a familiar embrace. Lucy woke up, rubbing her eyes, and when she saw where they were, she beamed. Home, she squealed, wriggling out of Grace's arms and running to the living room, where she grabbed her bear and began spinning in circles. Grace laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. The sound of her daughter's joy filled the house, breaking the heavy silence that had once defined the space. She turned to Alexander, who stood watching them with an expression she couldn't quite place, something between awe and relief. You really missed us, didn't you? She teased, a small smile playing on her lips. You have no idea, Alexander replied softly. He stepped closer, his gaze meeting hers. When you left, it felt like everything I'd built suddenly meant nothing. He took her hands gently in his. I don't want this place to be just a house anymore. I want it to be a home for you, for Lucy, and for me. Grace's heart swelled at his words, but before she could respond, Lucy toddled over, grabbing Alexander's leg. Uncle Alex, she giggled. Come play with me. Alexander knelt down, scooping the little girl into his arms. She laughed as he twirled her around, her delighted squeals echoing through the house. Grace watched them, her chest tightening with emotion. He wasn't just offering her a place to stay. He was becoming the family she had dreamed of giving Lucy. Later that night, after Lucy had been tucked into bed, Grace and Alexander sat on the couch, the glow of the fireplace casting warm shadows across the room. The tension of the past few days seemed far behind them, replaced by a peaceful stillness. Grace rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his. I was afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid that this would fall apart. That you'd regret helping me? I'll never regret it, Alexander said, his voice steady. In fact, I'm grateful you came into my life. You reminded me what it means to care about something real. Grace closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. For so long, she had been fighting to survive, but now for the first time, she allowed herself to dream again. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. As the flames crackled softly, Alexander gently kissed the top of her head. "We'll take this one step at a time," he whispered. "But I promise you, Grace, you and Lucy will always have a place here. With me." She smiled, tears of relief and joy slipping down her cheeks. "Then that's all I need." Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the moonlight bathed the mansion in a silver glow. The storm that had once defined their struggles had passed, and in its place was the promise of a brighter future. Together, months passed, and the mansion was no longer the cold, pristine space it had once been. It had transformed into a vibrant home filled with warmth, laughter, and the sounds of a family healing together. The once silent halls now echoed with Lucy's giggles, the smell of Grace's home-cooked meals, and the comforting presence of love that seemed to linger in every corner. Alexander had offered Grace more than just a roof over her head. He had given her the chance to rebuild her dreams. With his support, she enrolled in online medical courses, slowly working toward reviving the future she had once lost. On weekdays, she spent mornings studying in the home office Alexander had set up for her and afternoons playing with Lucy in the garden, while Alexander made time to join them whenever he could. One afternoon, as they sat on the grass under the warm spring sun, Lucy ran across the lawn with her bear in hand, giggling as Alexander chased her. Grace sat nearby, her heart swelling as she watched the two of them. Her daughter had blossomed, her laughter free and joyful, unburdened by the hardships that once defined their lives. Suddenly, Lucy stopped and ran back toward them. She threw her arms around Alexander and looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Daddy," she said softly as if testing the word. Alexander froze, his eyes widening. Grace's breath hitched, and tears welled up in her eyes. They had never asked Lucy to call him that, but in her heart, she had long known that Alexander had become the father figure her daughter needed. He knelt down, cupping Lucy's tiny face in his hands, his voice gentle and full of emotion. "I'd be honored to be your dad, Lucy." The little girl giggled and hugged him tightly. And in that moment, Alexander felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that went beyond his career, beyond money or success. Grace wiped her tears, smiling as she watched them. Alexander met her gaze, his expression a mixture of joy and gratitude. He reached out a hand, and when she took it, he pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her shoulder as they watched Lucy run back to her games. "You've changed my life, Grace," Alexander whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "And you've changed mine," she replied. That evening, they sat down for dinner as a family. The table, once a place for formal business meetings and silent meals, was now filled with conversation and laughter. As they shared stories and passed around dishes, Grace realized she had found more than a second chance. She had found a home, a family, and the kind of love she had once thought was out of reach. Victoria, the woman who had once threatened to tear them apart, was now a distant memory. When she had tried to contact Alexander again, he had made it clear that her place in his life was over. His future was here, with Grace and Lucy. As the night wore on, Alexander carried a sleepy Lucy upstairs and tucked her into bed, whispering promises of stories and adventures for the next day. When he returned to the living room, he found Grace waiting for him by the fireplace, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked, leaning into him as he wrapped his arms around her. "No," Alexander admitted with a soft chuckle. "But I'm glad we did." He pulled her closer. "Because this is exactly where I want to be. With you. With her. Always." Grace smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without the weight of uncertainty crushing her chest. This was her new beginning, and she wasn't going to let fear define her anymore. As the fire crackled, the storm that had once brought them together faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle hum of hope and the promise of a future built on trust, love, and second chances. They had weathered the storm, and now they were ready to face the future together.